Hi, everyone. I'm Ty Collins. Welcome to the latest edition of the Lawrence University Career Center podcast, where we check in with Lawrence alum to see what's happening with their careers. And this month, we continue with our recent alumni series, looking at Lawrence grads from the past few years. And today, we're joined by Luther Abel from the Lawrence class of 2022, where he earned his bachelor's degree in English. Luther was a non-traditional student, attending Lawrence after a 6-year stint in the United States Navy. While at Lawrence, Luther completed internships with the National Journalism Center and a National Review, and he was a frequent contributor to the Lawrentian, the school's student newspaper, where he wrote from a conservative political point of view, which earned him varying levels of scorn from his classmates. He's currently a Buckley Fellow with National Review and will soon be attending Northwestern to earn an MS in Investigative Journalism. Thanks for joining us, Luther.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Luther, as a student, you were unique in many ways, such as beginning college at the age of 24. What was it like going to college with classmates just out of high school?
Yeah, unique is probably the most generous adjective you could use for me. What was it like going to school with class? It was really nice. I enjoyed it. Out of many schools, I picked Lawrence because, first of all, the small class size would allow me to really speak with my fellow students, and we'd get to know each other as more than people sitting and staring at the professor, looking forward. And it was just so refreshing in many ways, coming from the military and being in a place where most everyone was seriously interested in academics. And I was honestly amazed sitting in my freshman studies course at how excellent 18-year-olds were at just the reading and the writing and expressing themselves. And it was just really affirming that I should have waited as long as I did at 24, because I wasn't ready at 18 to be like my peers in freshman studies. But I was just impressed by freshmen at Lawrence. So grateful, I guess.
You mentioned your military experience. You did serve in the Navy. During that time, you had a few different roles. Can you give us a glimpse into the life of a Navy sailor and how serving in the military impacted your approach to attending Lawrence, as well as the work you do today?
Yeah, maybe two ways here. So first, the Navy is industrial. You think of the Marines and they're, lugging backpacks, 80-pound backpacks out into the wilderness. In the Navy, you are, at least I was, a mechanic, which means I was working on giant contraptions for 12 hours a day. And then I'd go sleep and go maintain those giant contraptions again. So I worked on diesels, I worked on refrigeration systems, on cryogenics. So we made liquid oxygen and nitrogen in this big Dr. Seuss looking machine. If you've ever read Sneetches on the Beaches, it looked like that machine. So I lived at work, and everything was in service to keeping this ship afloat and moving forward. And so Lawrence was refreshing in that I only had to show up 3 or 4 hours a day, and I could go home to a real bed with air conditioning, and it was just exquisite. And I could pursue everything that I wanted to do in the Navy, when I wasn't working on contraptions, I was reading, and I'd read 5-6 hours a day, philosophy, fiction, whatever. I just wanted to know things and be somewhere else in my head for a while. And so Lawrence was kind of a continuation of that desire. And I guess when you do that sort of work for years at a time, you get to know just how far, I think it's kind of a cliched expression, but you can be stretched. How far can I go before I break? And in the Navy, I got pretty close to breaking a few times. When you're deployed and extended and going through some difficult things in challenging circumstances, you understand both your abilities and your flaws and learn to protect against them. Because of course, it's not only the work, it's not only missing being home, but it's also interpersonal stuff that you do experience in college in the dorms, where you have to learn how to get along with quite a roster of characters. But I think that's different than having to rely on those others to accomplish the mission. And I don't think there's anywhere else in the world really where you can have that sort of experience than the military. It's a lot of young people who are scared, who don't really know what they're doing, all pulling together in more or less the same direction to accomplish some really amazing things.
After graduating from Lawrence, you joined National Review as their William F. Buckley Fellow. Tell us about your fellowship. What do you do on a typical day? What have been some highlights over the past year? I did notice that you actually have the cover story back in December, I believe. Just kind of tell us what your fellowship's all about.
So my fellowship, I was an intern twice for National Review while attending Lawrence. And then after graduation, I had the opportunity to become a fellow, rather prestigious position. And it really every day comes down to, what do I want to write about? National Review, similar to The Atlantic in many ways, is a publication that allows its writers to pursue what they find interesting. And so for me, it has been defense. It has been some culture items. It's been regulation in the auto industry. Whatever piques my interest that day is what I'll go after. So the average day has me writing an article, one article every day, which is a fairly heavy load for most journalists. But the point of the fellowship is getting used to having constant output. And so it's rather blue collar in that way, where there are quotas and you are expected to meet those quotas. And if you don't meet those quotas, you have your editor calling you up and saying, hey, what's going on? But outside of producing, it's entirely up to me, which is freeing. But I think for young journalists, it's also rather difficult because there is so much to be written about, but so little that you know about. You can write on with any authority. It's an opportunity to be paid and learn on the fly. And a place like National Review is rare in that respect. And I'm just so grateful for the past year to have the tutelage, the opportunity to edit much better writers than myself, and write on what I wish to write about. Like my cover story was about how awesome Christmas trees are. And I have it framed behind me here. And I bought the original watercolor artwork that accompanied it in the magazine. And that's what it's been. And going forward, while I'm a student at Northwestern, grad student at Northwestern, I'll have the opportunity to be a weekend editor for National Review and continue writing for them as time permits. I'll have to roll back some of my commentary and opinion stuff because I don't want to represent Northwestern in a way that they see as not investigative journalism. So it's difficult to have two masters in that respect, but I'll continue editing for the magazine as I do investigative journalism for Medill and ProPublica.
You mentioned that you write every day, but I've noticed that you don't get published every day. How does National Review decide what gets published on their website or magazine of yours and what doesn't?
So it's a monthly quota. So it's not every day that I need to have something written, and that's good because some days I'm useless. Absolutely useless. You wake up in the morning, you look at the computer, and it's just repulsive. And those are the days I want to do editing because a lot of writing is beating yourself up. So if I can have the opportunity to edit something, I at least feel like I've accomplished one small item in a day. But there are other mornings where I wake up and I have 5 things on my mind that the world needs to know about. And so I am a fits and starts kind of writer. I've accepted that. My editors are okay with it. So a lot of that comes down, so much of journalism is the editors you work with. It's all relationships. And you can be a great writer, but an absolute jerk, and you are going to be moving on to a new publication every couple of years because so much of it is sitting side by side and working through items. And so if you have an ego, if you can't accept correction, it's going to be a difficult go of it. And that's probably what I've learned most in this past year, especially now that I get to be an editor and I have to manage the egos of contributing writers and staff writers. Yeah. That can make or break a career right there.
Once your articles are posted on the National Review site, some are free, some are behind a paywall. How does that get decided?
That is an item of debate. There are some pieces that I lobby to be made free because I think it is useful for, and again, this is my pride, I think it's useful for the national conversation to have it free to the public, to come in and check and see what the writers at National Review are saying. But at the same time, we are a business and we need to make money. And it is, in journalism right now, the question of how to make any sort of money in this business. And as we've seen with Vice News going bankrupt recently, you can have some of the most enticing, spicy stories in the world, and you still can't make any money. And so National Review saw this years ago and actually made a nonprofit wing, National Review Institute, through which most of the writers are actually paid. And that's where my pay comes from, is from the Institute. And so we become fellows of the publication, but not paid by the publication. Because even if you're not paying for the quote unquote labor, it's still a rough slog to be profitable or even lose only a little bit of money. So yeah, we make most of our money from subscribers and then some from ads, which are legion if you're not a paying member. And I don't like it. It's ugly. It's a pain to go to other publications and try to get their stuff without paying for it. But that's the way it is. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
It is a different business model today, and I'm not sure our students would even know this or remember this, but before the internet, the content that the writers would produce would only come in a paper magazine and would come, once a month, and you'd pay an annual subscription fee for that, and the magazine would have ads. And those subscription fees and those ads was how something like National Review made their money. And it's much different than that now.
Yeah, and I think it's also expectation. The market has come to expect that news items are free. And so people used to pay $50 a year for a newspaper, but suddenly they could get, enough articles online that it really wasn't worth paying any more for a newspaper that was getting thinner and thinner anyway.
And in the case of newspapers, the paper was nearly identical to the newspaper 30 miles up the road.
Correct.
An example locally, the Green Bay Press-Gazette, the Appleton Post-Crescent, the Oshkosh Northwestern, the Fond du Lac Reporter, they're almost identical newspapers within 90 minutes of each other.
And it's a bad newspaper.
Yeah, well, yeah.
That's the truth of it. Gannett is just a terrible organization. I learned more about it, that they have a formula that they stick to. They think it works for them. And I can't see that because they keep shedding more and more writers and editors. But, the only money they make is from obituaries. That's where the money is. You pay $800 to post an obituary, and that covers pretty much everything else.
I mentioned earlier that politically you're conservative. You currently work at one of the nation's leading conservative publications. Did you know the politics of Lawrence before you came here?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So my great uncle, Richard Nemi, he attended Lawrence and went on to become a published political scientist at Rochester. And so he taught there for many, many years. And he suggested Lawrence to me. And while he and I disagree on politics, Lawrence attracted me because I figured if my conservative concepts are worth anything, then I can go to a fairly liberal, progressive place and defend them. And if they aren't worth much of anything, well, then I will find the error of my ways and become an outspoken sort of blue lib kind of guy. But I'm happy to say that I was right all along. I was not convinced to change teams, though I am much more sympathetic to liberal viewpoints. And I figured that would happen because I wanted to know how liberals see the world, what they expect of others. So I think that helps my writing because I consider, unless proven otherwise, that most who lean left are very much concerned for the welfare of others, the good of others. And so when there are items that come up in the news where it's like, wow, how could you possibly believe this? Like, how do you think this policy is in any way a good thing? I can fall back on, I know many professors at Lawrence, I know many of the other students at Lawrence, and they have really excellent intentions for fellow man. And so, okay, then it just comes down to policy. And maybe we disagree on that, but we aren't mortal enemies. We're just people interested in similar outcomes who have different ideas for how to produce those outcomes. And that's much nicer. I mean, that's just a much healthier way to view the world, I think, than to say the other side is trying to destroy everything that is good.
And I don't think most people look at it that way. So I wanted to ask you, as a conservative, how you felt in regard to fitting in during your time at Lawrence, because this is a very liberal place with liberal students, liberal faculty. I have known some other conservative students who've left Lawrence during their first or second year because they didn't feel like they belonged here. They didn't feel welcome at Lawrence. Did you ever have that feeling of not feeling welcome? How did you navigate that complex political environment? And did you ever consider leaving because of that?
I never considered leaving. I thought the first 2 years of Lawrence were my best years at Lawrence. And I think a lot of that had to do with COVID. COVID just changed the complexion of the school. It changed the complexion of the country in many ways. But I never considered leaving because I love the school. And I think it's a good and necessary place. That said, I had the advantage of going home every night and leaving campus behind. I did not have the same sort of social pressure to conform that many conservative students or even students who are apolitical can experience on campus, do experience on campus. I mean, it's a close-knit community, and as with close-knit communities, the downside of that is there are social costs for being an outlier. So I had written in the past, I think my first internship at National Review, that conservatives should continue sending their kids to places like Lawrence, that places like Lawrence need these outside voices. But my first article as a fellow was saying maybe the 18-year-old conservative should not attend a place like Lawrence. And it broke my heart to write that piece because I just really appreciate the liberal arts. But I did not have to suffer socially in the same way that using the piece my friend Jack did, where he felt not only uncomfortable, but entirely excluded from the school. And he was a great guy. He got involved. He tried really hard, and it just didn't work out. And so I think for an 18-year-old who may have been more sheltered or is just not interested in the sort of exhibitionary or loud sort of liberalism that Lawrence has, I understand why others leave, and I don't know if I could recommend the school. For older students, I do think it's still one of the best places in the country to come and learn and experience as a conservative, because the faculty are tremendous. And even those who I disagreed with ad volume sometimes in class, it was all fun. Mm-hmm. And there are, especially if you're listening to this and you're feeling a little left out politically, I would say go to economics, go to a Wolf class, go to places that are kind of outside the mainstream of even professor thought on campus. Because while I don't think there's a single conservative professor on campus, there are places in the school where you can kind of get away from the political binary and just be a student without having to drag in the latest hot take off of Twitter. I think that exists at the school and will continue for a long time. So I've had to change my view a bit over time. And that's what has to happen sometimes. I can't be right all the time. But I do recommend the school to older students like myself.
Let's move on to your career path, which obviously is journalism. It is a career that's in a very transitional period right now. The impact of artificial intelligence is yet to be realized, but it will likely be significant. In addition, the news media is one of the least trusted institutions in America today. Looking at the industry, Luther, do you see a place for journalists who want to report the news fairly, or are they going into journalism for a different reason, perhaps advocacy? And where do you see the field of journalism going, and where does Luther fit in all of that?
So I would first point to the ideological hegemony of editors. So at a lot of the places we recognize as the leading institutions of journalism, so let's say ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, a writer can try to shoot it straight down the middle and just do phenomenal work. But he's going to be passing through multiple rounds of editors who have preconceptions and are writing the headline for his piece. So maybe he gets it straight, but the editors will represent it in a way that's more useful for one side or the other. And it's extraordinarily frustrating because you don't see who the editor on a piece is. I think if we're talking about transparency in journalism, posting everyone who has put hands on a piece is probably the best thing going forward. Now that can be abused, I suppose, some sort of backlash. But what you're seeing from a writer is not necessarily what he or she wrote. Yeah. Rather, it's maybe 70% what he wrote, but all of the important adjectives have been changed. So if you want to write at a place like CBS or NBC, New York Times, understand that your work won't be your own. It is the product of a larger institution that has its preconceptions, and you can either accept that, try to buck it, try to, keep pushing to have things return to how you wrote them, or you can go to sort of the new media. Problem with new media, places like the Free Press, Barry Weiss's outlet. Let's see, I'd say the Dispatch is a really good right-of-center but news-oriented outlet where they're conservative, but they're getting their facts straight. That sort of thing may be the future if you really want your words to be your own. And of course, there are places like Substack where you can kind of have your own news organization. But I will say editors make good writers the best writers, and it's difficult to have that sort of setup as, kind of a lone wolf with a Substack. There's demand for good journalism, but at the same time, there's so much demand for bad or slanted journalism, even from the best factual outlets. And I don't see that changing because, I mean, the New York Times has cachet. People know what it is. It exists. They have a built-in trust for those organizations that they've, developed over decades, more than a century, some of them. But I do think as especially the AP style guides become more and more politically slanted, that there may be pushback from the center, the political center, as they see otherwise good reporting fall more and more into activism. If you want to be an activist, you can go get paid anywhere. That's easy. I mean, Medill, Northwestern's journalism school, most of the concentrations at this point are some form of activist journalism. The most difficult, I'm in the investigative lab. That's one of the last holdouts of, I would call it old school journalism, where you just go and dig and find as much as you can. And then no matter what you find, you put it out there after verifying it. So that's a really long way to say, be a journalist, do good work, and make sure people know what you're doing, and you will eventually find a home. And follow specific writers. There are really good journalists at bad organizations. So sometimes it's better to just follow a writer than to follow a magazine or a newspaper.
Who are a couple that you follow or that you would recommend, specific writers or reporters?
My favorite, and will always be my favorite, is Kevin Williamson. He used to write for National Review, but now he's and then he was shortly at The Atlantic, and he's now at the Dispatch. But what he does is he goes and exists someplace, and he talks to everyone. And he's coming from very humble beginnings. He has wit and insight that more of a beat reporter isn't allowed to have, but that provides greater color and context. I would say to find a guy like Kevin Williamson, who will always be my favorite writer, because you know where he's coming from, what his past is, and so you can calibrate for blind spots and biases that he may be blind to, but most writers at his level know their blind spots and will acknowledge them and even provide feedback and counter arguments in the writing. And I think those are really the best journalists, those who go out and journal. So it may be 3,000 words, 4,000 words, but capture so much more of his beat for a year or two was white poverty. So in Appalachia, going out there, looking at the situation, who's to blame? How can it be fixed? Is it intractable? And then he offers what he can, but he gives you so much that you can come to your own conclusions and trust that it isn't edited to bring you to that conclusion. And that's proven by the amount of commenters on his pieces that disagree vociferously. And that's my favorite. So you see that sort of thing in The Atlantic, in the Dispatch, in a place like National Review, sometimes Commentary Magazine. And I think that's where the opinion journals really have a place that day-to-day newspapers aren't really allowed to go.
What do you find most rewarding about your work, and what do you find to be the most difficult part of your work? And for those Lawrence students who want to give journalism a try, what can they be doing now while they're still a student to get ready for it?
For the students, join the Lawrentian.
Yeah.
And write every week possible. I'm telling you, if you want to be a writer full-time, it means writing full-time. And so every Tuesday, which was usually the day we had to get submissions in, that'll come up really quickly in a school year. Do it. Write the piece. Push yourself through it. You aren't going to become a better writer because you graduated Lawrence. Necessarily, you're going to become a better writer because you've been writing at Lawrence and you get that feedback. And the Lawrentian is one of the few places where you can get in with very little experience, because I'm telling you, it is a big jump to go to a place like The Atlantic, New York Times, NPR. You need a sort of paper trail for years, or you need to be a really excellent writer right off the jump, which most people at 18 just aren't going to be. You need to get in your repetitions. So those of you who are at the con know 5-6 hours a day of practice is what you need to do to be proficient at your instrument. For writing, I mean, Professor McGlynn, he writes 2-3 hours every day. He just has that blocked off. I'm not that regimented. I wish I was. But when you're thinking about making this a full-time job, the people you're reading in The Atlantic have been doing it for 30 years. And they've been doing it at places that are a lot more humble than that outlet. So just understand it's work. There's a reason there's substance abuse in the industry, because there's a lot of self-loathing and there's a lot of being told no. So I don't want to make it sound horrible, because it's a lot of fun on those days where your piece takes off and people are talking about it and talking about it positively. But don't get this idea that you're going to be lounging on the couch and, sending in a piece once a week and that's it, and then going on a press junket to publish your book. It's a lot of work to get to that point, and there's no guarantees.
That is definitely an honest take on the field, Luther, and I appreciate you sharing that with our students. What about that most rewarding part of the job?
So most rewarding is that I get to write alongside my heroes. Where I mentioned Kevin Williamson before, I got to go out and have drinks with him for 2-3 hours in Dallas one time. And as an intern, I just hit him up on the company Slack and said, hey, can I come talk with you? Can we just kind of hang out? And he agreed to do that. So like, having a writing hero tells you that I'm a writing nerd, and yes, that's what I am. But I got the opportunity to do that. And I got to appear on Charlie Cook's podcast, who's another one of my writing idols. And he and I are actual friends now. And so to be in a room, to be on a Zoom call with the people you think are the best writers, the most insightful writers in the world, it's just unbelievable. I can't tell you how grateful I am for that, how rare it is. And I've had to cherish it these past months, because a lot of it is drudgery. A lot of writing is drudgery. It's a lot of, mashing your face into the keyboard because nothing sounds unique or worth writing. And then you just have to accept that some days you're not going to be a genius. And some days it's just going to be an article that 5,000 people read, they say, good enough, and move on. So it's quashing your ego long enough to push out good, solid writing, while also kind of acknowledging where you are, just how rarefied the area is that you're in. So you have to bounce between hating everything you write and loving everything you write. And some days you get that balance correct, and other days you're just staring out the window thinking maybe Walmart will hire you, because that would be easier than doing this.
Mm-hmm. Looking back at your 4 years of Lawrence, what do you think was the number one most important thing you took away from being a student here? And what was one thing that you wish Lawrence had taught you that they didn't?
The thing I took away from attending Lawrence was the names and numbers of the professors. As a student, you are paying a lot of money to be at school. And you're paying for access, really. That's what it comes down to. And so if you're a student and you're not going to office hours, if you're not asking professors about how they came to teach at Lawrence, about their experiences, I know we go into office hours and talk a lot about ourselves. Talk to the professors, because they're way more interesting than you are, because we're just starting out and they have decades of experience in these things that you're interested in. And they know people because they've had a student like you for the last 20 years. And those students are now in places where they can reference you. But you need to ask, you need to make Make them aware that you're interested in these things. I just cannot overstate how important it is to take advantage of the resources you have at Lawrence, because there are so many and they are so willing to help you, from the staff to the professors. Everyone is there. If you feel like a professor's standoffish, it's usually just because he or she is socially anxious and kind of a dork. And that's awesome. So don't feel that way. They want to help you. They're there for you. They wouldn't teach at Lawrence if they weren't totally invested in your success. Because there are plenty of places that are willing to pay really smart people to write and research things. But they're teachers. They're here for you. So I still meet with 4 or 5 professors that I had throughout Lawrence, even professors that I didn't have classes with, but we had similar interests, and I reached out, and so we continue to get coffee or get lunch at a diner or whatever. And so having stuck around in Appleton, I have this available to me where if I'm writing a piece on something that I don't know much about, I can reach out to someone in a department and talk about it and learn about it and get more information than I possibly could online in very short order, and get names to people in those industries that I wouldn't know exists if not for a professor's contact list. That's the best thing I took away, is the Rolodex, the contact list. The thing I wish Lawrence
had... I don't think you can use the word Rolodex anymore. It's over the head, you know.
I know, pain. Well, the thing I wish Lawrence had taught that Lawrence didn't. I don't think there's a single thing. And I don't say that to be generous. I think if I were 18 years old and graduated at 22, it would be a really difficult transition to leave campus, because it is a fairly protected environment there. And so I do wonder if in the future there might be more of a push to get especially rising seniors into apartments or something, because there's just a lot of learning how to be an adult in moving off campus while you still kind of have that social safety net of being a student. So maybe not for me, it being a lesson, but for those rising seniors to move out of the homestead of the block or two that Lawrence inhabits and being kind of cast into the broader Appleton, where you are, going to the grocery store every week, and you are going down to the laundromat and that sort of thing. And so I see now that people who I graduated with are, they're figuring it out, but I think it would be a lot easier for them if they'd had some experience with this before leaving campus.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Luther, and something I have and we have here in the Career Center noticed as well. More of a incorporation of life skills into the Lawrence experience is probably something that should be done. Well, we are almost out of time, but as we record this, you've been out of school for about a year. What is your best one piece of advice, regardless of major, that you want to give current Lawrence students?
I'm just going to borrow from Professor Wolf because I think he said it well. You don't have to have it figured out until you're 30, but I'm going to add, you don't have to have it figured out, but do something interesting before you're 30. So 6 years Navy, I got to see both coasts of the United States. I was in a nuclear engineering program. I deployed. I did some stuff, saw some stuff that differentiates me from pretty much anyone else my age. You don't have to join the military. You can do Peace Corps or whatever. But go out and mess around and try some things and make some money doing weird stuff. You don't get this period of grace ever again in your life. So get after it. Do not be passive in your 20s, because there's going to be a lot of life coming at you after 30. and you're going to be responsible to more people than just yourself. So while you are untethered to institutions, to another person, to a kid, go out, try stuff, fail, do difficult things, but try your hand at it and persevere through whatever you set your mind to. And you'll be grateful for it when you're 29, 30, and people ask, what have you been doing? And you can have something more than, well, I graduated 7 years ago, and I've just kind of been, hanging out since then.
Yeah, you're right about that. I think a lot of folks look back on their mid and late 20s as the good old days. So now's the time to do the fun stuff. Luther, any final words you want to share today?
I would just suggest putting off grad school until you've done something else. So I'm at Northwestern's Medill in their investigative lab program, which is their premier journalism concentration. There's only 6 or 7 of us, I believe. And we'll be writing for ProPublica, which is one of the leading investigative outlets. And pretty much everyone in my cohort has done more than simply attend school. So while I know it's attractive to go straight to grad school, and there's plenty of reasons for it, especially if you're in more of a scientific concentration, there's also a lot of professors at Lawrence who took time to go do other things. I think of Melissa Range in the English department, who is an incredible poet and came to be a professor in her 30s and 40s. So again, I guess I'm saying, don't expect to do everything all at once, and you'll probably be better for spacing out your education, because you'll have more to offer the other students, and you'll have more to offer the school, and you'll also be more confident in what you're capable of doing. And of course, there's a chance that you just never go back, that you leave Lawrence with a bachelor's degree, and then things happen and suddenly you're 40 years old, but screw it, Yeah. Go back to school then. Like, my program's 12 months. Even someone working a full-time job can leave work for 12 months and do that sort of thing if you really set your mind to it. Make sure you want to go and earn an advanced degree because it's worth getting, and only then do it. And probably do it only if you're getting paid to do it, honestly. If you're having to pay someone else to get an advanced degree, you probably aren't offering enough. That sounds harsh, but I don't want you going into debt for decades because it was a little too scary to do something else. So a little hard love to close this interview up.
That's a great note to end on, Luther. And we covered a lot today, from life in the Navy to career in journalism to surviving Lawrence as a conservative, and a lot more. So thank you very much, Luther. A great interview today. And thank you for joining us on the Career Center podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.